ladies and gentlemen, fellow asset capitalists, we have a treat in store for you. I've teased you about the five experts. There perhaps are only five people who truly understand money. I'm not suggesting the next guest is one of the five. I'll leave that for you to determine. But it is with great anticipation that I welcome the legendary. Imagine being called a legend. The legendary Dr. Lacy Hunt, someone who is not afraid to call himself an economist, a long tenured economist from the Federal Reserve. He was at he was striding the boards of the Dallas Federal Reserve in the year that I was born. This is a sprightly 80-year-old proof if proof was ever necessary that we become younger via the application of mischief, intellectual mischief, and curiosity. Lacy, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for gracing us with your company today.
All right, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
How do you feel with this term, economist? And we were chatting a bit earlier, and on top of that, you also lay claim to fame for being an econometric model builder. And these are things which fill me with dread. I see you more as a storyteller. I find your narratives are compelling, and I hope between us today we're going to complete the narrative of these very slow revolutions in money. I wish to discuss the malaise of a depression. I wish to I've heard you discuss in the past the travails of, let's call it, the 1830s. Let's move forward to the 1870s. Let's move forward to the 1930s. And boom, let's land in the present day. And let's join dots and create a narrative. But before we get there, let's talk about money. And I understand that you like an acronym. You like the ODL. And because this is Fed speak, it's the other deposit liability. But for you, this is money. So lay it down on me. Lay it down on the folks. What is this money?
Well, it's other deposit liabilities. It's actually the most moneyness component of M2. It's a superior alternative to M2. It constitutes about 80% of M2. It's really the main water carrier of M2. The difference between M2 and ODL is that M2 includes currency and money market mutual funds. Currency, all three of those things qualify in a certain sense as a medium of exchange, store of value, unit of account. But currency is not a medium of exchange across all transactions. You can't do multi-billion-dollar transactions in currency, and the role of currency is diminishing because more and more institutions require credit cards. They don't want cash. They don't want to be carrying cash anymore in their stores or their operations. And of course, currency can also be used as a store of value, but it's a cumbersome store of value. It's bulky, and you have to find a place to make sure it's safe, what have you.
Absolutely. I'm guessing that the key giveaway in the title ODL is actually the liability, that we're looking at the liabilities of banks. When you put money with them, it's their liability. They have for the last generation, the burden has been slight, which is to say interest rates have been non-existent, but there is an obligation to fund liabilities with assets, and those assets typically are the extension of credit into the wider community.
And that's the reason why ODL is superior, because it is the main funding for bank assets.
Exactly.
So ODL is not only a monetary aggregate, it is really a proxy for the credit aggregates at the depository institutions. And so it's doing both functions, I think.
Yeah, but
And really the superior measure. I fell into it by accident, because the Fed quit publishing the monetary data weekly. And so I wanted to be able to track what was going on. And I was able to find this component on the Federal Reserve release H8. And it's available weekly. It's a very telling indicator. It turns out that it's superior to M2.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to test that superiority in a minute. But if we were to put that in kind of cents and dollars and these newfangled thing called trillions, are we talking about, in absolute terms, are we talking about like $4 trillion of ODL?
No, well, M2 is about 20, and ODL is in the 16, $17 trillion range. So it's about 80% of M2.
Yeah. And it's like 75% of nominal GDP, give or take.
That's correct. Yeah.
And we should really, again, for the folks sitting at home,
keep in mind that when you look at a money aggregate, you don't just look at the money aggregate. You also have to look at its velocity, and you have to understand the properties of its velocity. And the properties of ODL velocity, in my opinion, are identifiable. Perhaps not easily, but they are identifiable.
Okay. Well, perhaps that's what's missing in the charts when I look at the charts. I want to, okay, so two things. Again, for the folks at home, I wanted to suggest that the ODL, if you will, is like a heap of coal, and we are instructed to move this locomotive forward, and we are given a responsibility to create speed. You know, we want this locomotive called the U.S. economy to move forward, this train of prosperity. And the ODL, if you will, is these large heaps of coal that we're putting in the furnace. Okay. And when you talk about velocity, I want to make an abstraction. I want to say that we have this $16 trillion heap of coal, but we have someone in between who is responsible for putting the coal into the furnace. And the endeavors of that industrious man or lady could be construed as velocity, i.e., their willingness, their desire to put the coal in. The pace with which they're putting the coal in will actually have a very strong bearing and determine the credit creation, which is to say that you can lead a horse to water, you can have $16 trillion of ODL, but if there's no willingness to put the damn stuff in the furnace, that train ain't gonna leave the station.
That's a very well stated reason why it's entirely foolish to look at ODL without understanding and also simultaneously considering what's happening to its velocity.
Yeah, and I understand.
One without the other is immaterial.
Indeed. So your father was I think a very notable psychologist.
Yes, he was. Very learned.
Yeah. I spend a lot of time being examined by psychologists. I'm fascinated. But anyway, I digress. But there's a psychology to this. And I think, and because the psychology is hard with your endeavor to build models, I fear it's not given the significance that it's owed. What do you say to that?
Well, no, psychology is extremely relevant. And I didn't realize this, but my father was a first-rate educator. He was a very wise man, and he introduced a lot of things to me, and he taught me psychology. And when behavioral economics came around, I said to someone, I didn't realize that I'd been a behavioral economist before I was an economist, thanks to my dad. But the way I look at it is that ODL or money is an endogenous variable.
Yeah.
In other words, it's not, ODL is not determined by the Fed. Fed has an influence on it, and the velocity of money is also endogenous. GDP, the inflation rate, the labor demand, they're all endogenous variables, and so you have to realize that both of them have a lot of moving parts. And one of the elements all the time is always the psychological factor. It's one of the reasons why econometric models have difficulty.
Indeed.
Because it's very difficult to gauge these things.
I prepared these little charts just to kind of put things in perspective. So I didn't have time, or I didn't have the capacity to find a long-term chart of the ODL, but as you correctly point out, ODL is perhaps 80% of M2. And if we were to look at this,
you have to splice it together. You have to hold the monetary data, use the flow of funds and the existing series. It by itself, the pure ODL statistic has a limited history, but you can splice it together. But it requires a bit of a tedious effort, so I'm not surprised you had some difficulty.
Yeah, and I like to cut corners anyway. So if we were to look at this top panel, and the red line is inflation, and we're beginning in 1945, and we're bang up to date, and this y-axis, this is 0, this is 10, and this is 20%. And the black line would be M2, and we're using that as very much the proxy for ODL. My issue when I look at that is, as much as I damn try, I can't get excited. I can't see.
No, and you couldn't, and that is the
drama.
Yeah. That's the correct interpretation. The great statement, Friedman's great statement that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. If you read Friedman's technical work, you will see that he said that this was based on the assumption that the velocity of money is stable. Now, when Friedman was writing and producing his empirical work there from the early 50s to the early 80s, he did no major work after early 80s. The velocity of money was stable. It wasn't constant, but the fluctuations were so unimportant that it really didn't matter whether velocity was moving up or down. It was in a really narrow little range. And so in that time period, the rate of change in money very quickly correlated to changes in nominal GDP. And then from there, it spread to economic activity and inflation. One of the things to sort of illustrate this for you, Paul Volcker, everyone recognizes as being a great Federal Reserve chairman, but he was also an outstanding economist. And he had a tremendous strategic view of the role of money. And in his book, which was his autobiography, which was written in 2018, he said that the monetary model that they followed when he was Fed chairman was the best then, and it's still the best now. And you may question why he would have said that, because he had acknowledged earlier in the book that when he was chairman, the simplistic model of Friedman only held because the velocity of money was stable. And Volcker was aware that Friedman had recanted on velocity being stable. But he still said it's the best model. So today, what I do is I look at ODL, and then I also look at velocity of money. And so, and they're both complex variables. They're endogenous. There are a lot of moving parts. But I am convinced that just as Paul Volcker was convinced, that the monetary model is still better than what we have. It's a complex model. It's not simplistic. And to assume that there is a direct relationship, just as you pointed out, is absolutely correct. And people that try to do that are going to be misled all the time.
Well, let's look,
Money velocity equals GDP.
let's look at that time series and let's apply the model, because again, in the upper chart, here we are, here's 1980, peak inflation, but here is money supply growth, and we see money supply growth peaking round about, I want to call it, there's 1975, I want to call that 1977. When was Volcker appointed? 79?
Volcker went in 79.
Okay, so Volcker really comes in right at, he comes in.
First of all, let me just looking at your chart here.
Yeah.
I know the chart very well, but I wouldn't rely on this chart.
Okay, so why? Let's examine why.
If you look at the 70s, you'll see that there was a big peak in 71 and 72, and then there was a secondary peak in 75 and 76. Okay. Now, the best thing to do is to look at the 3-year moving average,
Right.
but also to be simultaneously looking at the velocity of money. Now, you'll notice that the monetary growth is coming down there in 77 and 78, but the inflation rate does not respond.
Yeah, so that's this period here. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't respond very quickly. And as a matter of fact, you can already see the problem. I mean, we took a very significant recession in 74 and 75, but the inflation rate declined very, very mildly.
Yep.
And even though that was the deepest recession of the post-war period, it was deeper than the Great Financial Crisis recession.
Yep. It still left us with 4 or 5%. It looks like 4 or 5% CPI. This year, yeah.
Correct. Now, and the reason I think is that those two liquidity mountains of the early 70s and the mid 70s were really not reversed on a business cycle basis until the early 1980s. In other words, the influence of money is not just from its cyclical peak. You have to look at it in relationship to the long-term trends. Now, for example, in the Friedman wrote a very famous book there in 1969, early 70, called The Optimum Quantity of Money. And what he said, and keep in mind that he's assuming velocity is stable, but he said that to achieve a stable inflation rate, you should keep money aligned with the economy's production function. The production function is technology entering with land, labor, and capital. It's captured in the real per capita GDP. And so then in the 70s, the economy had a capacity to basically grow between, in terms of the underlying production function, of plus a 2% inflation rate of between 4 and 6%. And so anything above 4% in Friedman's optimum quantity of money is inflationary, right? And to be non-inflationary, you need the 3-year growth rate in that 4 to 6% range. Now,
this would be nominal GDP targeting with an upper band.
This did not happen. Volcker did not manage to achieve that until the early 1980s. And the current situation is very, very similar, because you see we have this massive liquidity mountain that was created in 2020 and 2021. And for the Fed to be able to restore price stability what they need to do is they need to reverse out that liquidity mountain. And but today, the velocity of money is no longer stable. At that point in time, the velocity of money was around 1.75. It's around 115 to 120. We've had a little bit of an upturn this year. My own calculations are given, we're now experiencing the first decline, annual decline in M2 in modern times in 2022. And ODL, which is my preferred measures, I think by the end of the year versus December of last year, it will be down about 3%. If the Fed stays on target with what they're planning to do, what they've stated they're going to do in terms of balance sheet roll-off, and given the dot plot forecast for the federal funds rate, by the end of March, ODL will be negative 8%. Nominal dollars.
Yeah.
And so here's the critical point. And if you want pablum, then don't listen to this. But by the end of March, the 3-year rate of growth in ODL, adjusted for the decline in velocity that we've experienced over the last several years, will once again put money in the non-inflationary zone, which today is not 4 to 6, because the economy is no longer growing at 3% per annum, or 3 to 4% per annum. The economy's growth rate really is in a 1 to 2% range. But by the end of March, if the Fed adheres to the course, money will once again be in the non-inflationary zone. Now, that doesn't mean, Hugh, this doesn't mean that the inflation rate is going to return to 2% in March, because the inflation will lag.
Yeah, we saw that in the 70s, that chart in the 70s, like you said.
That's correct. It will, but by late next year, if the Fed adheres to the course, and I'm saying this conditionally because I don't know what the Fed is going to ultimately do, then we will be back toward the 2% range.
Yeah,
and possibly lower when we go into 2025 and 2026.
Yeah. I think that's worth focusing on. Years since 1945, and this waterfall in M2 as a proxy for your ODL, and it is unprecedented in its rate of decline. It is substantial.
It is, but it by itself, it's not sufficient to erase that liquidity mountain. Not yet, but it will be, in my view. It will be.
No,
if the Fed is true to its word.
Indeed. Well, and the Fed is.
May I just make one quick point?
Please.
See, the Fed is rolling off almost $100 billion of their portfolio every month. So between now and the end of March, they will roll off another $500 billion. They are saying, based on their dot plot forecast, that they're going to raise the Fed funds rate 50 basis points in December, right? And then they're going to go another 25 in February. Well, as it turns out, a 25 basis point increase in the federal funds rate causes a reduction in total reserves of about 100 billion. So a 75 basis point further increase in Fed funds rate will result in another $300 billion reduction in reserves, along with another $500 billion from the roll-off. So total reserves, which are a component that determine ODL, before in 2019, it was 1.7 trillion. 1.7 trillion. It went to a peak of 4.3 trillion just before the Fed began tapering. Right now, it's 3 trillion, and by my calculation, on the Fed's plan, they will be at about 2.1 trillion in March.
So these trillions and these reserves. Let me again. I'm getting confused. If I'm getting confused, maybe some of the people watching are getting confused.
It's not easy. It's not easy.
Like we said, nominal GDP, let's call it 22 trillion. Let's just call it 22. ODL, let's call it 16. Now the reserves that you were talking about, that's the confusion, because it sounds as though you're talking about another form of bank reserves, not the bank reserves created by quantitative easing. Am I
No,
correct?
they are. That's how they were created, by quantitative.
That's how they were created.
You see, when the Fed buys government securities, they issue a liability against themselves.
Yeah.
And those liabilities of the Fed are an asset of the depository institutions.
Yeah.
So think about this. Think about this. We were at 1.7 trillion when the pandemic hit, and they took it up to 4.1 trillion. And so in 2020 and 2021, ODL and M2 on average for those 2 years grew by 20% per annum versus a historic average of 7%, and way outside any range of non-inflationary growth.
Exactly. But I forgive me, but I thought I'd read, I guess people just pluck numbers from anywhere. I obviously I have the utmost respect for your deductions, but I thought the bank reserves, this function of the Fed's QE policy with the COVID, had gone from $3 to $9 trillion. My numbers are very much on a different scale.
My numbers are coming right off the Fed's release, H41.
Okay.
The Fed's balance sheet is larger than total reserves, but and then of course some people take a balance sheet of the consolidated Fed and the Treasury, but the active ingredient is total reserves. Now, total reserves are linked to ODL by what is called the deposit multiplier. Now, the deposit multiplier is also an endogenous variable. It's very, very complex, but it takes into consideration the ability of the banks to charge all of their costs to their borrowers. And the banks have three basic costs. They have their overhead costs, their employee costs, they're running the buildings and networks and so forth. Then they have the cost of money. And the third cost that they have is the risk premium. And the risk premium is the likelihood that a loan or a security that they buy defaults. And as the economy begins to weaken, and I think we're beginning to see this right now, the risk premium is rising. This is one of those psychological components. And I think what we will find is as the banks start seeing their delinquencies increase, and they're beginning to see it, particularly in the subprime automobile market, the Cap 1 credit card metrics for September showed it. The consumers engaged in a massive leveraging so far this year. We've seen an unprecedented leveraging of household debt. That's what they had to do in order to cover the gap between their income and the surging cost of these basic necessities, food, fuel, and shelter. And so the consumer has leveraged themselves very dramatically. A year ago, the saving rate was 8%, it is now 3%. And they did that by physically taking on a lot of credit card debt. In fact, the banks are now pulling back on the credit card, and what we're beginning to see is an uptick in home equity loans. None of this is stable. It allows the households to get by from month to month, but it builds problems in down the road. And so as these delinquencies go up, the risk premium will rise. And even if the Fed at some point begins to raise the federal funds rate, the risk premium may rise faster than the Fed funds rate declines.
That's
and policy will prove to be very impotent.
I agree with that. So this whole conversation about velocity, I find it's an unwelcome abstraction. I want to put it to you that you've lived a long and varied life, to which I congratulate you, and I'm hoping to emulate. I can't emulate you. I'm in St. Bart's surfing, but anyway, I'm certainly curious. But I want to say that over the course of your life, the provision of credit and how it reaches the economy has changed dramatically. And I get frustrated that public servants kind of go, not my job. So let me explain. I want to say to you that there are three forms of money, and that it would seem that all of the Federal Reserve's endeavors are focused on the first. The first would be the ODL. It would be, which is the purview of the Federal Reserve as the sovereign domestic regulator of the banking system. Yeah. And then we have the Treasury on top, which provides insurance protection on those precious banking deposits. Okay. And I want to say up until the mid 1960s, that was the universe of money, or the way that money was created, or credit.
What you said is you just made the case for why you have to look at velocity. ODL captures the role of the banking system. Velocity picks up everything else.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's come at it.
It's money times velocity. So if you think the concept of money is changing, and it has changed, there's no doubt about it, that's why you need to focus on velocity as well. The two of them captures the banking and the non-banking system, the shadow banking system.
Yeah. But why not free the shadow banking, the offshore banking entity, free it from the shackles of having to discuss it through the prism of velocity? Why not just out it? So that, if you will, the second form of money is the non-sovereign creation of US dollars offshore.
Well, okay. All right. I see what I've tried to do is I've tried to piece it together on a micro basis, just as you're suggesting. And I'm going to tell you something, it cannot be done. There's simply not sufficient data. But you don't have to do that, because velocity captures it all. If you're making explicit recognition of the equivalent role of velocity, and that the two are partners, you're going to be okay. Let me just tell you something. The equation of exchange, which says money times velocity equals GDP, was developed by Yale economist Irving Fisher in a book called The Purchasing Power of Money.
In the 1930s.
1909.
1909, figure.
1909. Okay.
A long time ago.
Okay. So Fisher, when he originated the concept, he originally called velocity a dictum. In other words, he thought that it was an unimportant variable. However, Fisher did not see the Great Depression coming, and he wrote a mea culpa called "The Debt Deflation Causes of the Debt Causes of Great Deflations," and it was in the first issue of Econometrica. And he changed his tune there, and he said, in highly indebted economies, the velocity of money falls. Now, Friedman called Fisher America's greatest economist, and he followed Fisher's early work when velocity was a dictum. But Fisher had changed his mind and said that velocity is endogenous. Basically, he didn't use the term endogenous. I use the term endogenous. But that is the correct way to look at it. Economics does not stand still. It's like all sciences. We have technological change. You put a lot of smart people on these issues, and our knowledge will increase. For example, when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, he said that price was determined by labor content, that there was no role of utility or demand. The demand curve was not developed until 1870 under William Stanley Jevons, and it wasn't until 1900 when Marshall combined demand and supply to determine price. Economics is a science, it's evolving, and so what we have to do is, as we acquire more knowledge and our capabilities increase, we become more complex. And so the objective here is to try to capture the total picture.
For sure. You're describing a system based on dead men. Could I just ask, when
No,
was, okay, but
it's
when
not.
was the last relevant, earth-shaking, profound textbook on monetary orthodoxy? When was the last one published? The one that you go, yeah, that brings us up to date. Because we've just talked about the 19th century.
Well, look, I'm not in academia, but I read them all, and they're not up to date. As
But
a matter of fact,
they're 100 years out of
as,
date.
but that is their problem, not mine.
Well, it's
The,
our
the,
shared problem in terms of
the critical problem for me is that I understand velocity is not constant, and that it is endogenous, and it is going to be moving, and I have to be able to analyze it in an equal way in which I analyze what's happening to money or ODL.
Yeah, no, I respect that. I respect. Now, do you accept that the amount of non-sovereign dollar creation from offshore territories is actually many multiples greater than the dollars being regulated by the Federal Reserve?
Absolutely, but keep in mind here that the current system, whether we like it or not, is a dollar-based system. The dollar is still the reserve currency of the world.
Yeah, but it's made up of sovereign dollars and non-sovereign dollars.
Let me just finish. So basically, there's been a continuing saga of projections that the dollar would lose its reserve currency status. But ultimately, reserve currency status depends upon the relative strength and capacity of the reserve currency country versus the others. So let's look at some of the parameters. If you look at real per capita GDP, in Europe, real per capita GDP measured in US $10 is 38% lower than in the US. In Japan, it's almost 20% lower. If you look at the indebtedness of Europe and Japan versus the United States, we're talking 100 basis points to 300 basis points more. If you look at demographics, so for the time being, the dollar remains the reserve currency. So in the current situation, when you have a restrictive monetary policy in the US, which we've had, it gets transmitted to the rest of the world because much of their debt is denominated in dollars. So when the dollar goes up and dollar short-term rates go up, this creates an extreme burden on your dollar-based borrowers in the rest of the world. And another problem is that it also raises the cost of a lot of basic necessities, food, fuel, and so forth. And so when we inflate and then we have to adopt a restrictive monetary policy, then this is transmitted to the rest of the world. And so the Fed's restraint is being transmitted to Europe and Japan. And ironically, in this environment, what are the Europeans now doing? They're tightening monetary conditions on their own, even though there's restraint flowing through from the U.S. efforts through the foreign exchange markets. And so the world economy is heading for very tough times, my friend.
Well, that's my point, because if there is a provision of credit which is several multiples greater than the credit provision being regulated by the authorities, and I mean, to your point, the waterfall decline, if you will, in the small pond of credit, the ODL, okay, is looking kind of catastrophic. Historically, the rate of descent is looking fearsome in terms of the consequences for a sharp contraction in GDP. Okay, my point is let
me correct something you said there. It's very steep at the present time. It's unprecedentedly steep, but the money mountain that was created in 2020 and 2021 has still not been reversed. It will be contained by the end of March, in my opinion.
But that money mountain, I think there is a fallacy which I would associate with the banking reserves. Again, at the beginning.
Well, hold it. There's no fallacy in terms of what this money mountain did to the inflation rate. I mean,
well, there's a fallacy with regard to the dictum of velocity and money is everywhere and always a money. Inflation is everywhere and always a money.
Well, but the thing about it is, I'm not operating on Friedman's assumption that velocity is stable.
Right, but you are still going to
defending Friedman in that regard.
Okay, but what I'm trying to say is that mountain of money, okay, created in this terrifying pandemic environment. I want to say to you that the word we're missing from the vocabulary is it's latent. It's only fearsome when the psychology changes and the credit officers wish to use it to expand their asset base.
Well, here's the way I would look at it. So if let's say you're operating along and money growth is, say, going at 5%, you shoot it up to 10. If the velocity of money were to rise in that environment, then it would strengthen the income and expenditure side of the economy. Now, when the Federal Reserve was increasing money very rapidly in 2020 and 2021, what happened to the velocity of money? It declined.
Wow.
Not a great deal, but it declined. So when velocity declines, what that means is that more of the money being created went outside the income stream. It went into property. It went into financial assets. It may have even created the virtual currency bubble.
Crypto.
Okay, so now the Federal Reserve allows the economy to accommodate itself to a higher rate of growth in liquidity. Inflations do not work for people. The majority inflations are harmful. The majority of people do not benefit. We're in the worst cost of living crisis in 42 years. About 180 million Americans have suffered something like a 3 to 4% decline in their standard of living in the last year. And so the Federal Reserve is forced to reverse themselves. And so when they reverse themselves, it begins to put stresses. Economic activity begins to weaken, but liquidity is also drained from all of those poorer uses. And probably you might be able to say, and I'm not an expert in it, but the excess liquidity may have created this explosion in virtual currencies. And now, as it always does, monetary restraint exposes the weak or the ill-managed players.
Yes.
We're seeing that right now, this is not a new story. This is an old story.
Which repeats itself over and over again. But I still maintain that the human condition is to anchor itself to things that it can understand. Okay. And therefore we anchor ourselves to liquidity mountains.
Well, I'm going to have to disagree with you. I think that our educational system is failing us. And I see less and less awareness of these fundamental forces. I think that a lot of the information that is passed on is sound bites, ignorance of the complexity of the matter,
but we're talking from the same sheet.
Knowledge there that really doesn't exist.
I'm saying that. I'm agreeing with you. What I'm suggesting to you is that it was rather than the quantum of the banking reserves created by the Federal Reserve in its response to the pandemic. I think it was more their ability or their willingness. I mean, Jay Powell went on daytime television. He took his tie off and he said the preposterous thing, I'm from the Fed and I'm here to help you. And I'm printing money. I mean, he said he was liar, liar, pants on fire. I'm printing money. He did say that.
And actually, at conference, he said that he would not go outside the lender of last resort role, which he did. He became spender of last resort. He went outside the Federal Reserve Act in two important ways. He became to a certain extent, a spender of last resort, and he also coordinated with fiscal policy. The Federal Reserve was designed to be independent. There are two major historical examples of monetary and fiscal policy coordination. One was in 1971 between the Burns Federal Reserve and Richard Nixon, and then the pandemic response. In both cases, when the inflation rate blew up, the fiscal policy partners were absent, and the total cleanup job was left to the Federal Reserve. And that is precisely why that's why Friedman advocated rules. It's why John Taylor of Stanford University advocated rules, because is when you allow these major accelerations followed by major decelerations, you essentially boom the booms and slump the slumps. In other words, it's quite possible that monetary policy combined with fiscal policy had a massive era in 2020 and 2021, and now they're in the throes of creating another policy era. As a result, having to try to clean up a problem which both of them created. But of course, the Federal Reserve has no partner to help them in the cleanup measure.
But they're amplifiers. They amplify the situation.
Well, the situation is what it is.
Well, I think our ambition should be to be able to determine and influence the situation, or perhaps to.
They both made it worse. They both made it worse, and it's going to. I think it will. I believe that the pandemic response will go down as a policy failure, just as was the 71-72 experience of policy failure. And okay. I doubt that this whole episode of tightening will end in a happy way.
Yeah, I like when I take your analysis, that rate of decline in the ODL, when I see the destruction of the collateral-based non-sovereign dollar creation, I'm seeing real. I'm seeing imaginary dollar destruction, and like you say, allied with the worst cost of living crisis, like for the 99% of the population, and the Fed sitting there going, yeah, well, like look at the UK, like we're gonna our GDP is going to contract by 1.4% next year. I'm like, no, it's not. It's going to contract a heck of a lot more, my friends. And so again, it's a frustration that our understanding is so narrowly focused. I'm conscious of your time. I've got two questions for you. Let's use your history.
Let's take these last two then.
Yeah, no, indeed. People make the direct association with today in the 1970s, but you could also take it to the inflation mini peak the peak we saw after the Second World War. CPI peaked at 18%, I think, in 1948. Yeah. I want to say that the 1970s actually was sustained by monetary creation, whereas 1948 was very rapidly dealt with because there was not the exuberance of monetary creation. Where are you in terms of trying to find an anchor for today's inflation flare?
Well, keep in mind, during World War II, we had massive wage and price controls. And so at the end of the war, we had rationing as well. And so there was forced saving. The personal saving rate went up to 25% during World War II. People had acquired a substantial quantity of what we'll call savings bonds. They still have them, but they're not in use like they were then. And so when the war ended, you had this massive conversion from swords into plowshares, and people were able to finance it by converting their savings bonds into money. But that is a typical response of a post-war period. That was that was not an unusual situation.
Indeed, and the domestic banks didn't go, oh heavens, this is a hot potato. We've just received all these liabilities. We must create assets, i.e. money. They went,
No, the folks had essentially what was equivalent money asset wasn't defined as money. It was holdings of U.S. savings bonds.
Yeah.
And so when the GIs came back, then they drew their families drew their savings bonds down. They began to buy homes and cars. You couldn't buy a home during World War II.
Yeah.
So that experience, in my view, is not correct. The point of comparison for me with regard to the 1970s is that the modest declines in money growth in 73 and 74, and then again in 77, 8, 9, 80, were not sufficient to eradicate the money mountains of 71, 72, and 75, 76. And you didn't get the trend rate of growth in money in a non-inflationary zone until the early 80s. And so from understanding monetary policy, the key to whether we're going to move back to low inflation, it depends on whether the Fed erases this money mountain. And they're making a down payment.
They're making a down payment.
Achieving progress, but it's yet to achieve full fruition. If they can hang on through the end of March, I think they will basically succeeded, but not without cost to the economy, not without significant costs.
You see, I agree with all of that. Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think the 70s was different because the non-sovereign dollar creation remained frantic until the Fed damaged the economy, and then the non-sovereign credit providers pulled back. Whereas today, the non-sovereign dollar creators are actually contracting with the Federal Reserve. And so I'm very fearful about what happens next. But I'm on the same page.
I think another element that's very different, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but in the 1970s, you had the largest decline in the dollar in modern times of almost 40%. Because remember, Nixon closed the gold window in 71, and there was a big decline in the dollar then. And then as a result of the policies of Burns and particularly G. William Miller, the dollar fell further.
But that's my point. That's my point.
But now the Fed's restraint is working and the value of the dollar is rising. There's a major difference between the dollar in 1970 and the dollar today.
Okay, well, here's another interpretation of the same observation.
I'll be glad to send you the chart, but I mean, this is a well-known phenomenon.
No, hey, listen, the dollar weakness in the 1970s is absolutely well recorded and well accepted. Okay, the dollar strength today is well accepted and well recognized. We are not disputing that. We're disputing the underlying phenomena. Okay, and what I'm suggesting,
I think it's basically transmitting distress to the rest of the world and to us.
Yeah, but again, it's we refuse to look at the non-sovereign dollar creators, right? So in the 1970s, the Eurodollar system, which is reserveless, it is a system where you've taken the government out of the provision of credit. There are no reserve requirements, and it's a new thing. And offshore banks went crazy. They were ebullient.
Okay. Everything you say is true, Hugh. Everything is true, you say. However, the velocity of money picks up these influences as it pertains to the U.S. economy. And by the way, if you look at what's happening to velocity in Europe and velocity in Japan and in China, money in the United States is turning over about $1.15-20 cents. So every new dollar creates $1.15 of GDP. In Europe, money doesn't even turn over one time per year. Yeah, maybe only 88 cents or something. And in Japan and in China, money is turning over less than 50 cents a year.
Indeed. But to the point of the dollar weakness in the 70s and the dollar strength today, these two bookends, I'm saying to you, okay, what if my thesis is correct? that in the 70s, the ebullient banking community that resides outside the regulation of the Federal Reserve, that exists outside the sovereignty of the United States, created huge numbers of newly printed dollar bills, non-sovereign dollar bills, and the more supply, guess what? The dollar declined. And what I'm saying to you today is that same community post the GFC, the near bankruptcy of the financial system, especially the financial system offshore, means that they're not creating those dollars. And therefore, you don't have that supply. And guess what? The dollar's appreciating. You see how you can take that conversation and evolve it away from the velocity factor.
I don't think you have to do that. In fact, I'm convinced you don't have to. You and I are going to just have to disagree on that.
No, hey, listen, when you're a legend, you can do whatever you choose to do, especially a Texan legend.
Well, I know that I am a legend, but I have been around for a long time.
We typically end depressions with an innovation in the technology of credit provision, i.e., we find a means of expanding credit. And like you say, the US has gone from like 3% compound growth in the last 15 years. It's been more like 1 to 1.5.
I would say right now, since the late 1990s, when we became so over indebted, we've only been growing at about 1.3 or 1.4.
Okay.
In real per capita.
Yeah.
I give you a little statistic. When the pandemic hit, if you look at the trend line and where we were in 2019, we were 10,000 below the trend line. We're now 13,000 below.
Yeah, it's cumulatively growing now. Yeah. But do we require an innovation in money?
I think what we need more technological innovation, and we need another element that's working against us here is that we've had such subpar growth in the standard of living that our demographics are deteriorating. They're worse in Europe, they're worse in Japan, worse in China, and I think demographics are destiny. They really are important. Another element too is that as a result of becoming more and more indebted, the government efforts to try to help overcome the indebtedness and keeping the system on an upward trajectory is that we see a increased indebtedness, which is a combination of monetary and fiscal policies. And the marginal revenue product of this debt is dropping. And it's going to drop further because these shifts increase the government share of economic activity and reduce the private share of economic activity. And the private sector has a high multiplier. The government sector, in my view, is negative. And so as you shift further and further into command and control, you diminish your possibility for growth. And it's hard to see in the statistics, Hugh. But one of the reasons that Europe and Japan and China are lagging so badly the United States is that they are more advanced cases of command and control.
Yeah, no, indeed. But now I've heard, and I'm going to you don't have to answer this question now, given your time, but the depression of the 1830s, I want to say, ended with the discovery of gold on the US West Coast.
It did.
Yeah, which allowed us to expand the banking system.
I've written about that.
You have. I'm quoting you. The Wizard of Oz depression of the 1870s came to an end with the Scottish engineer who invented the leaching technology, which brought on the South African gold fields. Yeah, again, another innovation which led to an expansion in the provision of credit. Okay,
there was another element too.
Tell me.
The great MIT economist Charles Kindleberger, who wrote a book called Manias, Panics, and Crashes, one of the most fantastic books. Anyone should read it if they haven't. Kindleberger taught Ken Rogoff at Harvard, a really exceptional scholar. And he said when you have an indebtedness crisis, and it leads to a contraction in economic activity. There's two ways you can go. You can go with heroic response. In other words, you combine monetary and fiscal policy, or you have some type of innovation you're talking about to try to get you out of it. And sometimes that works. Sometimes it actually creates more problems down the road. It may provide a transitory benefit. But the alternative way, which we did after 1873, is we use Kindleberger's term, we let it burn out. We were on the gold standard, we were wedded to balanced budgets. And so we went through a very, very difficult period. But the marketplace basically adjudicated the problems of the extreme indebtedness of the 60s and 70s. And so by the late 1800s, the economy was very lowly indebted, and we were prepared to go forward. So a heroic response isn't always the best. To give you another idea, for example, if Japan had done nothing after 1989, like we were forced to do after 1873, then they would be long out of their problems. But they tried one heroic response after another, which have ground them further and further into a growth.
And I mean, you could say that they've deployed subterfuge, that actually they could not think of a heroic response, and so they created quantitative easing, which is latent money. It's a subterfuge. It is a leitmotif where you can pretend that you're doing something.
That's right. You need to assure people that you're the fiscal policy authorities, and it's like Mario Draghi used to say, I will do whatever it takes. And that presumes that he has the capacity to do whatever it takes. And in my view, the only way that you can try to do that is something extreme, which results in money printing, and then it results in high inflation, and then you damage more people than you hurt. They help.
And the Treasury bull market, 1982 to present, it's been half of your life. Yeah. All things end. This interview will end, I promise you. And are you a Buddhist? Will the Treasury bull market end, and in what circumstances?
Well, the main thing that I would say to you right now is I think that we're in the zone of the peak. There's a good possibility we've already seen the peak in long-term rates. It'll be we're in a transitional phase. Transitional phases are always difficult. A lot of ebb and flow, but I think that we're going to see the yields come down as we go through the course of next year, and then I think it will extend.
I agree. Listen, you've been so kind to my badgering. I think I've been the rudest person ever to interview you. I apologize. But I leave this conversation mystified and of course humbled by your many, many decades of service and your great curiosity. I thank you very much.
You're certainly welcome. All the best to you.
The legendary Dr. Lacy Hunt. I think that's one of those interviews where my role is to listen, not to interject, which being the acid capitalist is nigh on impossible. I think you maybe can sense the frustration that Lacy almost has the Fed fog, that they recognize and they give lip service to this Eurodollar entity, this universe. But they come back and they say, oh, it's too complicated. And again, I say to you, Elon, there's a big if, but if Elon Musk, A, can turn around Twitter, B, if you can get a man to set foot in Mars by the end of this decade, come on. How difficult is it to get the data, right? The US has supremacy in terms of the theater of fear, right? Already it's like, if you trade with Iran, you're struck off. If you trade with Russia, you're struck off. So tell me, how difficult is it to go to the very same international banks that are responsible for the Eurodollar system and say, guys, I'm thinking, I need your Eurodollar data. Now, what this euro dollar thing, right? Let's talk about it. Lacy admitted, and I think the Fed admits. So where were we? We were saying these monetary liabilities, these deposits of the banking sector onshore. I think we were saying there's $16 trillion. And that's the purview of the Federal Reserve. It's the local bank regulator looking after $16 trillion. But offshore, in the anarchy that exists offshore, there's maybe 2x, 3x, 4, it's maybe $100 trillion. Now, what are these dollars? They're not fictitious. They're real. You can use them to buy things, but typically it's to buy risk assets. These euro dollars, these non-sovereign dollars, which are being created by HSBC, by Societe Generale, by ICBC, by the international combine of the banking sector, they're not for you. If you're an American household, this is not for you. But you become impoverished by them because this is the fuel which has ignited asset prices over the last while. Now, it's in abeyance. Lacy talked about how the rate of US GDP growth is now a third. It is 1/3 of what it used to be. Okay, why is that? And again, why, looking at the 1970s, why did we have this persistency in inflation? And why am I convinced that inflation, I mean, there's a permanently higher level, but there's going to be a cliff drop in the rate of expansion in inflation? And the answer is in this non-sovereign creation of dollars, that in the late 60s going into the 70s, this was like a new thing. Like, you're a bank and you could create dollars without the feds up your ass, right? It was taking government out of the system. It was like, you don't need reserves. You don't have to back it with reserves. You just have to use your acumen and your counterparty understanding of risk. And then you run it over just 24 hours. What can go wrong in 24 hours? Big question. But anyway, in the 1970s, this non-sovereign Fed fog money, it was multiplying. They're like, this is amazing. This is incredible. This is so sexy. And the Fed sitting there looking at M2 going, oh, the velocity seems to be changing. Shut up about velocity, right? Quantify the euro-dollar system. That's my point. Today, again, the Fed is looking at $16 trillion. Oh, we got to raise interest rates. At the same time as this euro-dollar system what's happening today, right? So this fabric, this is the matrix, a fabrication of dollars. Dollars are created in America where you put dollars on deposit and the bank then creates dollars by extending a loan. Offshore, you come to the bank in its window, it's like a bank teller. It's like, hello, what can I do for you today? And a year or so back, you go, hey, I'm from Japan and I've got zillions of yen-based treasury bills. I'm wondering, can I give that to you, put it on deposit? Will you give me back a loan in US dollars? And the bank goes, would love to, for 24 hours. And let's discuss it 24 hours time, right? But as you've seen in the collapse in the yen, over the course of the last 2 years, kind of counterparty risk. People are going, Japan and my Japan counterparty. And what have you done with the dollars that I gave you? You've taken like term and commercial risk in China. And I'm like, I don't like this. And your currency's weakening. So you go, knock. Hey. 24 hours later, I want the money back. So what's happening is you gave them dollars and now you're like, no. I want the dollars back. You're seeing the contraction in non-sovereign dollars at the same time as this sovereign regulator onshore jacking rates up. At the same time as the political inflation coming out of the chaos and the anarchy of Ukraine and Russia and the supply disruption. Can I just say to you people, I think we forget. We had a pandemic. We may as well had Martians that came down. The man from Mars, he didn't eat cars. He was eating bars with people inside. This was scary, right? And in the midst of all that, we had a profound, we're crazy people. We had a profound and crazy fiscal response to try, which created supply mayhem. The idea, I mean, it was pretty cool. You got to sit at home for 18 months. I mean, the Twitter folk are still sitting at home, it would seem. And now we're seeing the consequences. We fucked up the supply system. And now you've got dollar bill destruction overseas. You've got the Fed effectively heading to 20% interest rates. You've got the 99% of people who are not getting wage increases, whose bills are up here. And so we call that a cost of living crisis. And people think that we're going to have a bit of a downturn. You think we're going to have a bit of a downturn? We're going to have an almighty fucking downturn. So welcome. Hello, is anyone there? Welcome, right? Here is half the life of Lacy. Here is 40 years of yields collapsing from the Volcker yield, the Volcker years, collapsing from 16%, 20%, what I was 10 years, 16% to nothing during the pandemic. And, you know, I like my lines. And I've been saying that we're kind of this is the death zone for treasuries. Okay. We've broken the trend, but markets are not linear in outcomes. In that when you have lines, they get broken. You create fear, you create anarchy, you create uncertainty. This is the anarchy of uncertainty. The magic anchor has been broken. You know, it's like, oh my God, I thought the earth was flat. Maybe it's round. That's where we're having this like deep psychosis, okay? I want to say to you, let's zoom in. That's like many, many years. Let's look at the last year. And would you believe I put a little circle? Why did I put a circle here? This was the peak. We got to almost 4.5% 10-year treasury yields. I thought I was attracted by that rate of ascent in the trend. Very severe, usually kind of marks some intermediate top. Anyway, here we are today at 380. I was managing a hedge fund today. I'd be sorely tempted. I'd have treasuries. I'd have a Delta One exposure. I'd buy. So say I had 100. Let's be bullish. I was running $1 billion hedge fund. Let's be really bullish. I was running a $10 billion hedge fund. I mean, if we think of last week's guest, Jeffrey Sharman, he's running 100 billion. Okay, I'd buy 100 billion treasuries today. Maybe I'd buy 50 billion. And I'd buy a bit more if yields go up. But I think that 4.5% could be the top. So if we buy there and it goes 380 to 450, you lose 18%. That ain't nice. And that's why maybe I would taper my size into it. But if we come down to 2.5%, you make like 55%. I think we're going to come all the way back down with one handle, in which case you are a hero. And of course, that's just on a Delta One of like 1x your NAV. I mean, typically we'd have to look at volatility, but typically you might run 2x, 3x. So I'm going to go out there. I think I want to lick. Let me kill this screen to end this ramble. And it is a ramble, but I'm fed up listening. I want to lick the honey from the Treasury bond yield at 3.8. If I'm wrong, I get closed out above 450, but I think we're going to 150. Boom, mic drop. I'm out of here.